Hello everyone. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. The Late Night Cigarette. It was around 3 in the morning when I found myself sitting in my quiet home, casually watching a movie on my PC, while alternating between short bursts of gaming and scrolling through random internet threads. The stillness of the night had wrapped itself around everything, and the silence inside matched the darkness outside. At some point, I noticed I had run out of cigarettes, a trivial inconvenience in the grand scheme of things, but one that nudged me out of my chair and reminded me of a small routine comfort often took for granted. The only place still open at that hour was the local gas station not too far, maybe a few minutes by car. Even though walking was an option, I chose the quicker route and grabbed my keys, locked the door and headed off, not expecting anything unusual from this short late-night errand. I live in a small European country, often hailed as the safest in the world, a place where people leave their doors unlocked during the day and where danger seems like a faraway concept. But safety, like many things, is relative. Bad things may be rare, but they are never impossible. After leaving my quiet neighborhood and pulling out onto the road, I took a familiar right turn to join the main stretch that would take me to the gas station. It's a simple route. Drive straight for about half a kilometer, then make a left for another half kilometer, and you're there. The night was cool and calm, and the streets were empty, illuminated by the occasional streetlight that painted golden circles on the asphalt. Then, I noticed something that didn't fit into the picture of sleepy safety I'd grown so used to. A girl was walking alone on the sidewalk. That's not so odd in itself, but there was something about the way she moved that caught my eye. She wasn't just walking, she was practically power walking, glancing over shoulder frequently, her pace faster than normal, and there was tension in her body language. A closer look revealed 2 men following not far behind her. They weren't just walking in the same direction, they were pointing at her, whispering things, making aggressive gestures. The girl's expression was filled with terror, and even from the car, I could see that she was holding back tears, her lips quivering as if she were swallowing panic. Every instinct in me told me something was wrong, and without hesitation, I slowed the car and pulled over beside her. Rolling down the window, I asked gently if she needed help. She only gave me a desperate nod, no words, no hesitation, just silent fear written all over her face. I told her to get in quickly, and she did, glancing back over her shoulder as she climbed in. I locked the doors and explained to her that I was heading to the gas station to buy cigarettes, but that I'd take her home immediately after. She thanked me, her voice barely above a whisper, and then fell into a heavy silence as I drove. At the gas station, I quickly bought my pack and grabbed a bottle of water for her. She didn't say much, only took it with trembling hands and sipped slowly. She was still shaken and kept checking the rearview mirror, as if half expecting to see those men right behind us. After the purchase, we retraced the same path back, passing the place where I'd first seen her, but by then, the 2 men were gone, no trace of them, no evidence they had ever been there at all. I asked again if she wanted to go to the police, but she said no. All she wanted was to be home. As we drove through the quiet streets, I couldn't help but think how random and fragile safety could be. Just a few minutes later or earlier, and I would have missed her entirely. What if I hadn't run out of cigarettes that night? What if I'd gone to bed early or decided to walk instead of drive? I didn't want to dwell on those questions, but they haunted me. That chance timing might have saved her from something much worse. When we reached her building, she looked up at me with eyes that had just begun to dry. She thanked me again and stepped out. Disappearing into the building's dim lobby, I waited until the lights turned on inside, just to make sure she had truly gone in, and only then did I begin the drive back home. The night had taken on a different hue now, no longer calm, but eerily still, as if the shadows held more than just the absence of light. I kept thinking about the men's faces. I hadn't seen them clearly, just enough to know they were up to no good, just enough to understand that her fear was real, The realization that something so sinister had been moments away from unfolding in such a peaceful town shook me more than I admitted to myself. Back home, I sat in silence for a long time before lighting a cigarette, the one I had left to buy. It didn't bring the usual sense of comfort. Instead, it reminded me of how that craving had pulled me out into the night at exactly the right time. I thought about the unpredictability of life, how tiny choices can place you on a path where you're either the one needing help or the one giving it. I wasn't a hero. I didn't fight anyone off. I didn't call the police. But I had made a simple decision to act when something felt wrong. And sometimes that's enough. I hoped she was okay now, wherever she was, and that the terror in her eyes would eventually fade. Days passed, and I found myself checking the local news more than usual, fearing to see a story about an attempted abduction, but nothing came up. No arrests, no missing person reports, nothing. It was as if the entire thing had slipped past the notice of the wider world, like a nightmare confined only to those who had experienced it. I didn't even know her name. I didn't ask. It didn't matter at the time, and now I regret that. I'll never know what really happened before I arrived or what might have happened after, if I hadn't been there. It's a strange sort of helplessness, to be both the interruption and the outsider in someone else's story of survival. There's a quiet responsibility that comes with that kind of moment. Not the burden of being a savior, but the quiet knowledge that you were, however briefly, someone's last option. And when you live in a place where bad things are rare, it's easy to forget how important it is to pay attention. I started to take less for granted after that night. I became more aware of the small signs, the way someone walks, the way a street feels under dim lights, the unusual silence that sometimes surrounds danger before it erupts. You begin to understand that safety is not a guarantee. It's a privilege, and you're lucky every time you get to return home unscathed. Eventually, I stopped thinking about it every day, but I never fully forgot. Even now, sometimes, when I see someone walking alone at night, I remember her face. I remember the nod she gave me, the unspoken plea. And I wonder how many other people are walking just a few feet away from danger without anyone noticing. I can't be everywhere, and I'm not always going to be in the right place at the right time. But that night taught me that sometimes, when you are, you owe it to the world to stop, to ask, and to care. Story 2. The Van by the Lake. When I was 11 years old, I travelled with my family back to China from Australia, where I had grown up after emigrating as a child. We made trips every few years to visit relatives, and though I had been born on the outskirts of Beijing, my memories of China were few and fragmented. That winter in 1997, we arrived in the middle of a heavy snow season. It was colder than anything I had ever experienced in Sydney, and my wardrobe from Australia was no match for the bitter chill that cut through the streets of my grandparents' small town. Early in the trip, my cousin took me to a local mall where I picked out what I thought was the most fashionable piece of clothing I had ever seen, a fluffy pink duffel coat, trimmed with white faux fur. I wore it every day like armor, a bright spot of color against the grey snow. My grandparents introduced me to a brother and sister who lived in the same building as them, and we became fast friends. The girl was a few years older than me, maybe around 14, and her little brother was probably 6 or 7. We spent our days wandering around the town, throwing snowballs, eating snacks, and chattering in a mix of Mandarin and broken English. One afternoon, we made our way to a large park on the edge of the town. It was spacious and peaceful, with a frozen lake at its center, trees dusted white with snow, and paths winding through patches of untouched landscape. The city noise faded as we reached the park's quiet edge, and for a while, we played freely along the shore of the lake, skipping stones and laughing without a care. As the sky turned dusky and the golden sun lowered behind the buildings, I noticed how deserted the park had become. The paths that had held a handful of scattered pedestrians were now empty. The trees stood bare and silent, and the distant crunch of boots in the snow had ceased altogether. That's when we saw them, 2 men slowly approaching from the other side of the lake, cutting across the open space in a direct path toward us. One of them waved and called out to me in Mandarin, claiming to be a friend of my father. He said that my father had asked him to pick us up and take us somewhere. Immediately, something about the man's demeanor, his tone, and the way he stared made every part of me uneasy. My father, I knew, was in another city entirely and wouldn't have sent anyone to find me without warning. I froze, but the girl and her little brother stepped forward protectively. They began making excuses, saying we had to get home, that we weren't allowed to go with strangers, all the while slowly backing away. The man didn't press, but I saw him glance over his shoulder toward his companion. The second man was standing beside a white van, its back door already open. He didn't say a word, just waited, watching, as if ready to pounce if things didn't go according to plan. It was only then that I realized how isolated we were. There were no other people around anymore, no adults nearby, and no easy path to safety without crossing back through the snow-covered fields toward town. I couldn't stop staring at the open van door, my breath fogging in the cold air, my legs trembling. The next few moments felt like a dream unraveling in slow motion. We turned and walked away. Not running, not yelling, just walking, hearts pounding, breath sharp in the frozen air. I kept expecting to hear fast footsteps behind us, or to feel a hand grab my coat, but nothing came. When I dared to look back, the two men were still standing in place, watching us go. The van remained parked with its door ajar, an open mouth waiting to swallow us whole. The walk back to my grandparents' building took maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. With every step, I felt danger at my back. Imagine being tackled into the snow or dragged into that white van, never to be seen again. But we made it home, our boots sloshing against the stairs, the warmth of the lobby washing over us like sunlight breaking through clouds. I burst through the apartment door, my words tumbling over one another as I tried to explain what had happened. My mom and grandmother listened, but their reactions were subdued. My mother seemed embarrassed, even annoyed, brushing it off as childish exaggeration. At the time, I didn't fully understand her reaction, but in hindsight, I believe it had more to do with guilt than disbelief. She saw my near abduction as a failure on her part to protect me. And in a culture where family reputation and parental responsibility are deeply intertwined, she may have preferred to forget the entire thing rather than confront what it meant. I stopped bringing it up after that, learning quickly which topics were best left behind. Years later, after becoming a mother myself, I've revisited that memory many times in the quiet of my Sydney home, especially on cold nights when the wind scrapes against the windows. The headlines that now flood the news in China about kidnapped women, forced brides and missing children make my blood run cold. I often think back to those two men in the park and how differently things could have gone. It's not just the abductions that haunt me, it's the aftermath. So many stories speak of women being trafficked into remote villages, their legs broken to keep them from escaping, their identities erased, their lives rebuilt as prisoners of fate. Some are sold as wives, some as surrogates, and some are simply never seen again. The children, too, fare no better. Boys are often sold to families who cannot conceive, brought in as sons but never truly accepted. They may be fed and clothed, but they're never fully loved. Girls are even more vulnerable, vanishing into forced marriages or being trafficked across provinces like goods with no voice. That snowy afternoon could have ended with me as one of those nameless victims. Every detail still lives in my memory. The way the snow crunched beneath our feet, the chill that settled deeper than skin, the way the man's eyes never stopped watching us. If we hadn't left when we did, or if the park had been just a little quieter, I might not be writing this now. What chills me most is how ordinary it all seemed until it didn't. A quiet evening, laughter between children. There were no warnings, no screams, no dramatics, just a moment where reality shifted and something dark reached out from the shadows. Even now I think about how predators don't need chaos to do harm, they prefer silence, predictability, a sense of routine. We were just 3 kids on a snowy walk, and for a few minutes, we were also targets. That realization is what has stayed with me the longest. Not the fear of what could have happened, but the knowledge of how close it came to happening without anyone ever noticing. I'm safe now. I live far away. I have my own children, and I never let them wander far without supervision. But I also know that safety is fragile. It is not a promise. It's a hope we carry, a belief we try to maintain. And that bright pink coat I once wore, the one that made me feel stylish and grown up, I keep it stored away in a closet. Not because I'm sentimental, but because it reminds me of that moment when I learned, far too young, that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like an ordinary man standing beside a van with an open door, wearing a smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes. Story 3. The gold Versa behind the Home Depot. I was 19 years old and living in a quiet desert town in Arizona, a place where the skies stretch endlessly and the roads seem to run through nothing but sand and silence. My daily routine was simple. I worked in Phoenix at a small mechanic shop, where I fixed up broken down vehicles, changed oil, and kept to myself. The drive was long, about 60 miles each way, cutting across open highways with few cars and even fewer buildings. The isolation didn't bother me, and I often found peace in the empty landscapes. But there was one habit I couldn't shake, something I'd picked up from my late grandfather: cigars. He used to smoke them with me when I was younger, and though I knew it wasn't healthy, the act of lighting one up after a long shift became a ritual of comfort. My girlfriend and her parents, who I lived with, were strongly against smoking, so I'd sneak behind the nearby Home Depot after work to smoke alone in peace. That evening felt no different from any other. I finished work, picked up my usual cigar, and parked in the small lot behind the store. The night was calm, the parking lot dimly lit by a few flickering lights, and the surrounding area was still. I stood leaning against the hood of my car, scrolling through social media and watching the glow of the cigar illuminate the tips of my fingers. After about 20 minutes, I noticed an old, beat-up gold Nissan Versa parked across from me near the loading dock. At first I thought nothing of it. Maybe it belonged to a night shift worker or someone waiting for a ride, but something about it felt out of place. It hadn't been there when I arrived, and it sat completely still, the windows tinted, the engine silent. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was nothing. But 20 minutes later, when I checked again, I realized there were two people inside. They were just sitting there, unmoving, staring directly at me. They didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even blink as far as I could tell. My unease grew with every passing second. I put out my cigar, got into my car, and started the engine. Maybe they were just resting. Maybe I was being paranoid. Still, I didn't want to take any chances. I pulled out of the parking lot and made my way toward the freeway. As I merged onto the main road leading to the I-10, I glanced into the rearview mirror, and there it was, that same gold Versa, following close behind. At first I convinced myself it was a coincidence. Maybe they were heading in the same direction. But as I turned onto the highway and began speeding up, the Versa kept pace. I merged into another lane, then another, trying to shake them. My car, a powerful model my grandfather had passed down to me, was more than capable of losing a cheap economy car. I accelerated past the city limits, pushing the speedometer into triple digits. When I finally slowed back down, thinking I had left them behind, I looked back and there it was again. The Versa was still tailing me, gaining on me. I felt my throat tighten and my heartbeat quicken. They weren't just following me, they were hunting me. I sped up again, weaving through the dark, nearly empty lanes, trying to lose them. Eventually, I reached a small exit and pulled off to stop at a Maverick gas station to refuel and calm down. I figured I'd grab a drink, use the restroom, and collect myself. The parking lot was empty except for a few distant vehicles. I stepped inside, bought a couple of energy drinks, splashed water on my face in the bathroom, and then returned to the front door. And there it was, the gold Versa, parked right next to my car, but this time it was empty. Every hair on my body stood on end. I pulled out my phone, intending to take a photo of the license plate, only to find there wasn't one. The car had no plates at all. Before I could react, two tall, thin men emerged from the shadows of the parking lot. They were white, lanky, with strange marks all over their faces. Their eyes locked onto mine, and without saying a word, they began sprinting toward me. I ran to my car, slammed the door shut, and hit the lock. One of them reached the passenger side window just as I started the engine and began pounding on the glass, shouting something I couldn't understand. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I threw the car into gear and backed out hard. The other man jumped into the Versa and tried to box me in as I pulled away. My tires screeched as I dodged him, nearly losing control in the process, but somehow I managed to keep the car steady. I sped out of the lot and onto a side road, taking sharp, random turns down dark, unfamiliar streets. Eventually I found a long driveway with tall shrubbery lining both sides. I pulled in, turned off the car, and sat in complete silence for 15 minutes, watching the shadows and waiting to see if they had followed. But there was nothing. No headlights, no engines, no movement. Just silence. I wanted to call the police, but what would I even say? There were no plates, no physical contact, just two men, a creepy car, and a feeling in my gut that told me they wanted to hurt me. I sat in that driveway wondering what I had done to provoke them. Had I been targeted at random? Had they been watching me for days, waiting for the right moment? Why follow me so far, 50 miles, into the middle of nowhere? It didn't make sense. And the not knowing, that's what scared me most. I eventually made my way home, shaken and silent. My girlfriend was already asleep, and I didn't tell her until the next morning. Her reaction was instant and firm. Never go back to that parking lot. I took her advice. Since that night, I haven't returned to that spot behind the Home Depot. I found a new place to smoke, somewhere public, somewhere well lit, but I've never forgotten those eyes staring at me from the dark car. The sound of my tires peeling away from danger, or the feeling of complete isolation as I raced down a highway with nothing but fear on my back. It wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't a hallucination. It was real. It happened. And I still wonder what might have become of me if I hadn't left when I did, if I had hesitated even for a moment longer. Story 4. The Girl on the Train. It was late one evening, and I was on my way home from university after a long day of lectures and labs. The train platform buzzed with quiet chatter as people waited for their rides home, but I kept mostly to myself, scrolling through messages and watching the time. In my country, the train seats are designed in groups of 4 two-seats facing 2 others, creating a shared space for strangers to sit across from each other. Most of the seats were already taken when I boarded, but I noticed an open spot directly in front of a girl who looked a little younger than me, maybe by a year or 2. She seemed harmless enough, just sitting alone with a chocolate bar in hand and a far-off look in her eyes. I approached politely and asked if I could sit. She gave me a strange, intense look but nodded and said yes. I took my seat and tried to focus on my phone, but the atmosphere quickly grew uncomfortable. I could feel her staring at me, not just in passing, but with a quiet, unwavering intensity that seemed to burrow under my skin. She had large, unblinking eyes that didn't flinch when I glanced up. To distract myself, I continued browsing online. That's when she broke the silence and asked me, "Where do you live?" The question struck me as odd, especially from someone I had just met on a train. I hesitated, then tried to brush it off with a vague response. Undeterred, she asked which stop I would be getting off at. I gave her a name, just to keep things simple, and she immediately told me she'd be getting off at the very next one. Something about the way she said it sent a chill through me. She then began singing to herself, something soft and strange that I couldn't quite make out. It wasn't in a language I recognized, and it seemed more like a chant than a song. Her gaze never left me, and it felt like she was waiting for a response, as though she expected me to join in, trying to lighten the mood. I said, "It's okay to be silly," hoping she'd laugh it off and return to her chocolate. But instead, she stared deeper, and without warning, blurted out, "You're so pretty." Her tone wasn't exactly a compliment, it felt like an observation from someone studying a specimen. She asked if she had chocolate on her face, and indeed, she did. It was smeared across her cheeks and chin, but she didn't seem to care. She offered me a bite of the bar, which I declined. Suddenly she shifted topics, talking about a missing piercing one she said had fallen out of her lip. She tried to put it back in right there on the train, wincing and fumbling with it in front of me. I suggested she visit the place where she got it done to have it fixed properly, just to change the subject. Then she asked if I would come with her. I declined politely, already feeling the tension in my muscles, my nerves buzzing. Her reaction was swift and unsettling. She declared that she was completely in love with me. The train car fell quiet in my ears as the words sank in. That didn't help. Her expression darkened, She leaned in slightly and whispered that she would beat up my girlfriend, kill her even, then marry me. Her voice dropped to a breathy whisper as she added, "I love you." I froze, unsure how to respond. She continued to speak in that same eerie, calm tone, telling me she'd kidnapped me after we got off the train, asking again if she could come home with me. Her behavior had crossed from eccentric to frightening. I stopped replying and stared out the window, counting the stops until my destination, wondering what she might do when we arrived. Each second stretched into minutes, and every announcement of the next stop filled me with equal parts hope and dread. When the train finally arrived at my stop, I stood up, ready to walk briskly away, but she stood too. Just before I exited, she leaned in and whispered, "Are you leaving, my love?" I gave her a quick nod and hurried out. The platform was mercifully full of people, which gave me a little comfort. I maneuvered through the crowd quickly and took the nearest exit, weaving through other passengers and slipping into a nearby convenience store just to give her the slip. I waited there, pretending to browse until I was sure she hadn't followed me. Only when I stepped out into the cold air and found no trace of her did I feel my breath begin to return to normal. For days after that encounter, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I took different routes home, avoided public transportation when I could, and stayed around groups of people. I even considered reporting the incident, but what would I say? A strange girl confessed her love to me and threatened my imaginary girlfriend. There was no physical harm, no crime committed, just words and an unsettling presence. Still, it felt like a violation, as though my safety had been quietly breached in a place I had always felt comfortable. I never saw her again. Maybe she found someone else to fixate on, or maybe it was just one strange moment in a life full of strangers passing through each other's stories. But I often think back to that ride and wonder what could have happened if I had let my guard down, if I had laughed at her jokes or accepted the chocolate. There's something eerie about a threat that hides behind a smile, about danger disguised as affection. That encounter taught me that not every threat comes with raised voices or a dragon. Sometimes it comes dressed in softness, in whispers, and in eyes that never stop watching. Even now, when I ride the train home after a long day, I find myself checking the seat across from me before I sit down, and every now and then, I think about how thin the line is between harmless oddity and real danger. The scariest part of that night wasn't what she said, it was the way she made me feel like I had no way out. That kind of fear lingers, long after the doors have closed and the train has moved on. Story 5. The apartment viewing. It was just a few weeks before grad school when I flew out with my boyfriend to a small town I had never been to, hunting for a place to live. I had lined up several viewings through Craigslist, trying to get ahead of the semester. One of the first places on my list was in a remote residential area, not exactly near the city centre, but seemingly peaceful and quiet. The landlord had seemed normal over email, if a bit terse, and asked me to call him an hour before the appointment. I did just that, but he didn't pick up. Figuring he'd show eventually, my boyfriend and I decided to head to the house anyway, hoping someone would be there. About 10 minutes before our scheduled meeting, the man called back. His voice was slow and strangely flat, like someone playing a part in a play they didn't understand. I mentioned that we were already in front of the house, and that my boyfriend was with me. That's when his tone changed. "You never told me you had a boyfriend," he said coldly, as though I'd broken some unspoken rule. I explained casually that he wasn't moving in, just here to help me look. There was a long pause, and then he said something I didn't quite know how to interpret. Sometimes people don't tell me when they're married. It surprises me. He hung up after that. I turned to my boyfriend, who looked more concerned than ever, and suggested we should maybe leave, but I hesitated. The market was tight, and I didn't want to lose out on a good place just because the guy had bad social skills. As we stood debating, a young man came out of the house. He glanced at us, then bolted to a car and sped off without a word. That was the first real sign that something wasn't right. Moments later, the landlord arrived. He was tall, probably in his 50s, and unnervingly muscular. His eyes were completely emotionless, empty like grey windows with nothing behind them. He approached slowly and said, "I'd shake your hand, but mine are dirty." He then launched into a barrage of questions, directing all of them to me while completely ignoring my boyfriend. What was I studying? What other places was I considering? Was my boyfriend going to move here later? His tone never shifted, never showed any inflection, and the entire time, his eyes never blinked. My boyfriend asked a few simple questions, things any landlord should be able to answer, but the man offered nothing in return. No explanations, no small talk, just silence. Then he said, "Let me show you the basement." We should have left then and there. Every red flag had been waving for the past 10 minutes, but something in me kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe he was just awkward. Maybe this is just how people are in small towns. We followed him to the back of the house where a detached shed stood. He opened the door to reveal a pitch-black stairwell leading downward. He flipped the switch at the top, but no light came on, and instead of commenting on it or making a joke, he just stood silently at the top step, looking down into the darkness. Then he started descending, slowly, one foot after the other, disappearing into the black without a word. "Aren't you coming down?" he called out. My boyfriend answered before I could. "There's nothing to see if the lights are out," he said, forcing a smile. The man stood still for a few seconds, then climbed back up, closing the door behind him. He led us inside the house. That's when things turned from creepy to disturbing. The front door locked automatically behind us, and when my boyfriend tried to unlock it discreetly, the man became visibly agitated and told him not to touch anything. We pretended to comply, but my boyfriend managed to keep the door slightly ajar. The man kept steering us into smaller and smaller rooms, reaching into his pockets repeatedly, only to withdraw his hands when we looked. There was a strange setup in the house, supposedly. A grad student already lived there, but nothing about the home looked lived in. The textbooks were pristine and generic, as if purchased for show. There were only 3 shirts in the closet, a single bowl of fruit on the table, and an empty fridge. No dishes, no utensils, no signs of real life. The man refused to answer basic questions about the supposed tenant, what school they attended, how long they'd lived there. Then he showed us every room in the house except for one. When we asked about it, he said it was just an attic. "Nothing up there," he said. "Just some old furniture and probably a bad smell." I stood near the door and caught a whiff of something foul, the kind of scent that doesn't belong in an empty house. Still, I nodded along and smiled, pretending everything was fine. We made our excuses and headed for the front door. He followed us out but didn't say goodbye. He climbed into his car, but as we turned the corner, I looked back and saw him get out again and wander back into the house. That night we couldn't stop thinking about it. My boyfriend couldn't shake the eerie feeling he'd had the whole time. I did some searching online and found 3 things. First, the landlord was well known in the community, someone people seemed to respect. Second, there was no record of him owning or managing any rental properties. And third, the address he gave us was his personal residence. The thought that he'd staged the whole rental listing just to lure someone there made my skin crawl. The young man who fled earlier, the weird setup, the unfinished basement, it all painted a picture we couldn't ignore. We didn't report it. There was no crime, no real evidence, but I never contacted him again. For days afterward, I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, replaying everything. What if I had gone down into the basement? What if my boyfriend hadn't come with me? There was no telling what might have happened. I've walked through plenty of strange situations before, but nothing ever made me feel the way that house did, like I was being watched not by a man, but by a predator playing with his food. That house wasn't meant for living. It was a trap. Everything about it was a performance, staged just enough to make someone like me step inside and feel just safe enough to let their guard down. I think about that locked door, the way it clicked shut behind us without warning, the way his eyes never left mine. The missing details, the silence, the too clean table. It was all wrong. And worst of all, I'll never know what that locked attic truly held. Maybe nothing. Maybe something I wouldn't have come back from. That day taught me to trust my instincts. No house, no rent, no convenience is worth risking your life over. I learned to pay attention to the subtle signs that chill in your spine, the urge to leave, the feeling that you've entered somewhere you were never meant to escape. Story 6. The basketball invitation. It was the middle of winter when I received a message from a guy I had crushed on for years, someone older, charming, and always a little mysterious. We both played basketball, he on the boys' team, me on the girls' team. but he rarely spoke to me outside of practice. That night, though, he invited me to play a quick one-on-one game at the town's outdoor basketball court. I remember hesitating. It was late, and the ground was frozen from the day's snowfall, but there was something flattering, almost dreamlike, about the invitation. I asked my best friend to come with me, just to be safe, and the three of us met under the flickering streetlights. She quickly got bored and cold, especially with how flirty he became, so she left early, trusting him to give me a ride home. I agreed, not sensing the danger that was quietly setting in around me. After about 30 minutes of shooting hoops and small talk, I began to feel the chill seep into my bones. I told him I was ready to leave. He agreed and walked me to his car, but once we were inside, he didn't start it. Instead, he sat there with his phone in hand, scrolling silently. The engine remained off, and the heater never came on. I waited, growing more uncomfortable by the second. Then, out of nowhere, he started talking. He told me about his sexual fetishes, about how he found pleasure in causing others pain. He spoke in a slow, calm tone, as if confessing something beautiful. He said no one really knew him, not even his friends, and if they did, they would be terrified. His eyes never left mine as he revealed this darker side, and I felt my stomach knot in dread. I laughed nervously, trying to shift the topic and urging him to take me home. He didn't argue, but instead started the car and pulled out of the lot. At first I relaxed, thinking that maybe he was just trying to be edgy or weird, but soon I realized we weren't heading back to my friend's house. He took a different road, one that led away from town. The farther we drove, the more isolated the surroundings became. Snow-covered trees lined either side of the gravel road, and the headlights seemed to carve through endless darkness. I asked him where we were going, and he smiled. "You'll meet some people," he said. "People who will really like you." I didn't know what that meant, but I could feel the panic start to rise. He then said something that chilled me more than anything else that night. He told me I seemed like the type of girl who'd enjoy being submissive to a group of men. "I wouldn't even have to make you beg," he added. My mouth went dry, and I searched my pockets for my phone but remembered I left it back at my friend's house, plugged into charge. My heart pounded as I tried to stay calm. I started asking him questions, anything to distract him, anything to buy time. Then, during a moment when he was laughing at something he said, I reached for his phone resting in the console and grabbed it. He didn't notice. That was when the car slowed to a stop. We were in front of an old shack, almost hidden by the trees, with no lights and no movement. "They're waiting," he said. "Don't make them angry." He told me to get out of the car. I clenched his phone tightly, heart racing, and made a choice. For a second, he looked shocked. Then he started laughing deep and loud, as if I had told him a joke. He claimed it was all just a prank, that he wanted to see how I would react. He even called me gullible, but I didn't put the phone down, and I kept my hand over the screen, thumb ready. Eventually, he turned the car around and began driving back, still chuckling, trying to ease the tension. We pulled into my friend's driveway. As I stepped out of the car, he rolled down his window and said softly, "I'd really appreciate it if you never told anyone about this." Then he drove off into the night. I stood there, shaking, not just from the cold, but from everything that had nearly happened. I was 15, and though I didn't fully understand the weight of what had just occurred, I knew that I had narrowly avoided something horrific. I went inside and didn't tell anyone, not my friend, not my parents. I felt too embarrassed, too uncertain of how to even explain what had happened. It wasn't until years later that I realized how close I had come to vanishing into the dark. 2 years later, when I was in college, I saw him again at a party. He came up to me, grinning, as if we were old friends. He apologized for that night, said he was drunk, said he didn't mean any of it, but before I could respond, he tried to kiss me, tried to pull me into a room alone. That's when I snapped back into that frozen car, the shack in the woods, and the false laughter. I shoved past him and left the party immediately. I never saw him again after that, and I never want to. I realized that night, he wasn't just some dumb high school kid trying to act tough. He was dangerous. and he had meant every word he said in that car. Now, years later, I think back on that moment often. It shaped how I move through the world, how I assess danger, how I measure trust. I still carry that moment with me, the moment when I looked at an empty shack in the middle of the woods and knew, deep in my bones, that if I stepped out of that car, I wouldn't have returned. I've learned to listen to my instincts, even when the danger is wearing a familiar face. And I've learned that sometimes survival comes down to one clear moment of bravery, even if your hands are shaking and your voice is barely steady. Story 7. The Whistling in the Woods. It was during the summer of 2010, a time when childhood still carried the magic of late-night adventures and sleepovers under the stars. I was around 9 or 10 years old, living in a quiet Midwestern neighborhood where the streets curved gently and the houses were nestled in long rows of trees. One night my friend Chase invited me and 2 other neighborhood boys over for a sleepover. Chase's house was the ideal place for unsupervised fun. He had older parents who were often away, his mother traveled frequently for work, and his father, who had been paralyzed during the Gulf War, required caretakers who weren't always present. The house sat alone atop a small hill, surrounded by woods and facing away from any neighbors, giving us the perfect blend of privacy and mystery. That evening, Chase suggested we camp outside at the edge of the woods behind his home. None of us were particularly thrilled about it, but the idea of sleeping in a tent beneath the stars felt too adventurous to decline. We agreed, with the condition that we stay close enough to the house to run in if we needed snacks or a bathroom. We pitched our tent right where the yard met the trees, dragging in blankets, sleeping bags, flashlights, and all the junk food we could carry. As the sun dipped below the trees and the sky turned a deep shade of blue, we laughed, told stories, and played games until one by one, we began to doze off. I was always the first to fall asleep at sleepovers, but that night was different. I was shaken awake in the middle of the night by one of my friends. "Hey," he whispered urgently. "Do you hear that?" At first, I thought he was just trying to spook me, but then I heard it too, a soft, drawn-out whistle, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. Each whistle was slow, breathy, and spaced out, like someone deliberately taking their time. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't birds. It was human. Another boy was already awake, wide-eyed, listening intently. We sat silently, trying to determine the direction of the sound. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It was somewhere in between, too close for comfort. Then we heard it again, long, slow, and deliberate, as if someone out there was waiting for a response. The third boy woke up, groggy and confused, and we all huddled in the center of the tent, our flashlights off, our ears tuned to the darkness. We debated whether it could be one of Chase's father's caretakers, maybe staying the night, maybe walking the dog, but it didn't make sense. The whistling was coming from inside the woods, not from the house, and it was getting closer. The sound moved slowly, growing louder and clearer with each passing minute. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They were taking their time, like a hunter circling its prey. It took us about 15 minutes to quietly put our shoes back on, unzip the tent as silently as possible, and sprint up the hill toward Chase's house. We left everything behind: our sleeping bags, snacks, game consoles, even Chase's prized Nintendo DS. When we reached the house and its brightly lit driveway, we finally stopped running. The lights made us feel brave again. We convinced ourselves we were being silly, just kids scaring each other over nothing. Chase went to the garage and pulled out our airsoft guns. Fueled by the rush of adrenaline and the need to reclaim our courage, we started yelling into the woods, firing into the trees, shouting empty threats. We kept it up for a few minutes before the noise faded back into stillness. No more whistling, no footsteps, no voices, just silence. Eventually we retreated into the house and fell asleep on the living room floor. We tried to laugh it off, pretending we'd scared off whatever or whoever it was, but deep down, none of us believed that. The next morning, under the comfort of daylight, we went back to the tent to retrieve our stuff. As we approached, we immediately noticed something was wrong. The tent was destroyed. The rain tarp had been ripped off and one side was collapsed. It looked like someone had caved it in with their fists. It wasn't the wind. We hadn't left it like that. Inside it was worse. The snacks had been dumped out and stomped into the dirt. Several sleeping bags were slashed open, the stuffing pulled out and thrown into the surrounding brush. Chase's DS had been snapped clean in half. But the most disturbing part was the large, deliberate slit along one wall of the tent, straight and deep, like someone had stabbed it with a knife and dragged it all the way through. We stood there in silence, staring at the wreckage, all our previous bravado gone. No one spoke. No one joked. We just started picking up what we could and brought the ruined pieces back to the house. Then we got on our bikes and went home. None of us told our parents. We were afraid they wouldn't believe us, or worse, they would. We didn't want them to ban sleepovers or scold us for staying in the woods. And maybe, on some level, we didn't want to make the fear real by speaking it out loud. We drifted apart naturally after that summer. Chase went to a private middle school, and the rest of us ended up in different classes. Years passed. I never thought much about that night until recently, when I ran into one of those boys in our hometown. We reminisced about old times, and as we talked, I brought up the night in the tent. His face changed immediately. Without hesitation, he remembered everything. The whistle, the fear, the tent. It wasn't just in my head. We both stood there, suddenly pulled back to that dark summer night, and everything we'd buried came rushing back. After we talked, I spent hours jotting down the memory on my phone, unable to stop. What haunts me most is how calm it all felt until it wasn't. If there's one thing I learned that night, it's this: trust your gut. Story 8. The girl who wouldn't let go. It started when I was 12 years old, at that confusing age where feelings are messy and friendships blur into awkward romantic experiments. I was in middle school, still childlike in many ways, but slowly becoming aware of how others perceived me. At the time, a lot of boys in my class had crushes on me, which only made things worse. Other students teased me relentlessly, calling me names I didn't understand and isolating me from their cliques. My self-esteem plummeted, and in trying to stay liked and safe, I overcompensated by being overly friendly to everyone, even the outcasts. That's how I ended up dating someone I didn't really like. He was socially awkward, a bit obsessive, but I didn't think much of it back then. When he asked me out, I said yes out of pity. It was easier to say yes than to hurt someone's feelings. We dated in the way that kids often do: clumsy conversations, exchanged notes, short walks between classes, but it always felt off. He was more attached than I was, always watching, always texting. I didn't realize at the time that he had already begun to obsess over me. Eventually, after 6 months of discomfort, I broke up with him. I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. He started messaging me constantly, showing up uninvited, and finding ways to insert into my life again. He'd appear at places I never mentioned to him, and even more disturbingly, began showing up near my home, hiding in the bushes outside, and waiting for me to appear. At first I thought it was just a phase, a lovesick kid who would get over it, but that phase never ended. What made it worse was my own guilt. I kept wondering if I had done something wrong. Was I too nice? Did I lead him on? I was too young to understand that his behavior wasn't about me at all, it was about control. He told me we were meant to be, citing memories from early childhood that I had long forgotten. When I tried to ignore him, he grew more desperate. He would lash out at anyone I tried to be friends with. He even followed me at school, lingering outside classrooms and trying to talk to me between every class. I couldn't go to the bathroom without checking if he was nearby. Every bell felt like a countdown to another unwanted encounter. I tried to keep things civil, hoping he would calm down, but it only made things worse. He clung to any attention I gave him and twisted it into a reason to keep chasing me. Once, when I was with a group of friends, he grabbed my arm and tried to pull me away. My friends intervened, but it shook me. I didn't feel safe anymore. My parents noticed how withdrawn I'd become and decided to move us to a different part of town. I thought the distance would solve everything, but he found my new house. He showed up uninvited again, standing at the edge of our yard like a shadow. At that point, the fear turned to dread. I didn't know how far he'd go, and worse, I felt powerless to stop it. Eventually, he spilled a sob story to our school's guidance counselor. I don't know what he said, but it worked. One day I was pulled from class without warning and made to sit across from him in the counselor's office. "He needs closure," she said, not understanding the trauma he had caused me. I sat there in silence, trapped in a forced conversation, while he rambled about our so-called connection. My mother was furious when she found out. She chewed out the school for putting me in that position, and after that, the school distanced itself from him. He still stared at me from afar, and his friends made creepy comments, but the physical closeness stopped at least for a while. Then a new girl transferred into our school, and everyone noticed something strange. She looked exactly like me. We weren't related, but the resemblance was uncanny. We could have been sisters or clones. At first we joked about it, pranking people by swapping places. But then she told me that guys kept calling her by my name. One of them even started flirting with her in a way that felt familiar. That's when I realized my stalker had turned his attention to her. She didn't mind at first until he realized she wasn't me and dropped her cold. It was disturbing, seeing him try to replicate his obsession, like he was trying to replace me. Ironically, that lookalike girl and I started dating. Yes, I came out as a lesbian, and for a while, it felt like life was finally turning around. But of course he didn't take that well. He left creepy notes on my desk, made veiled threats, and once again started lurking in the background of my life. Eventually, I transferred schools entirely, thinking I'd finally be free. And for a long while I was, but years later, out of nowhere, he messaged me again. "I need closure," he wrote, falling back on the same excuse. I didn't respond. Then he messaged again and again photos of his new girlfriend who looked disturbingly like me. Messages claiming he was happy now, as if daring me to acknowledge him. Even now I look over my shoulder in public, half expecting him to be there. He never physically hurt me, but he stole something else, my sense of safety, my ability to trust, my freedom to exist without fear. That kind of damage lingers, no matter how much time passes. I'm happy in my life now, but the anxiety he planted in me never completely faded. I don't know what he's doing these days, and I don't want to know. All I hope is that no one else ends up living under the same quiet threat I did, where every knock on the door feels like a warning, and every stranger's stare feels like a ghost from the past. Story 9. The truck that followed me home. It was a quiet, cold night, and I was driving back home from a long shift at work. The highway stretched endlessly in front of me, a dark ribbon surrounded by flat plains and empty skies. There were no cars around, no lights on the horizon, and my phone had lost reception miles ago. It was one of those drives that feels timeless, just you, the hum of the engine, and the faint glow of your dashboard. I wasn't tired, but I was slipping into autopilot, my mind drifting. That was when I saw it. Parked along the side of the road was a massive black semi-truck, completely black tractor, trailer, wheels, everything. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside, and it sat there, dead quiet. Something about it made me uneasy, like it wasn't resting, but watching. I slowed as I passed, glancing toward the cab. Nothing moved. No lights flickered on. It looked empty, abandoned even, but I knew it wasn't. My gut twisted in that familiar way that tells you something's wrong, even if you can't explain why. I pressed down on the gas and pushed the feeling aside, convincing myself it was just an ordinary trucker catching some sleep. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why was it so far off the road? Why all black? Why no markings? No license plate? It was unsettling. I told myself to shake it off and focus on the road ahead, but a few minutes later, I heard the deep rumble of an engine coming to life behind me. I looked in my rearview mirror, and there it was, those headlights. The truck had pulled back onto the road and was speeding toward me. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Maybe the driver had just woken up. Maybe we just happened to be heading in the same direction, but it didn't feel right. I stayed calm, changed lanes, slowed down, then sped up. No matter what I did, the truck stayed close, its headlights too bright, too high, practically blinding me. My pulse started to race. I'd driven these roads 100 times, and I knew how quiet and lonely they could be. There were no exits, no towns, just stretches of highway and nothing else. I was completely alone with this truck. Then, as if to confirm my worst fears, the truck turned off its headlights. Just like that, darkness swallowed my rearview mirror. But I could still see its silhouette, hulking and black against the night. It was still there, following without lights. I floored the gas, hoping my car could outrun him. My hands trembled on the wheel as the engine roared, and I weaved through the empty lanes, searching desperately for a side road, a rest stop, anything, but there was nothing. Only black road and blacker sky. After a few frantic minutes, the silhouette began to shrink. I didn't see it disappear, I just noticed that it was gone. The headlights never came back on. It simply faded into the distance. Relief washed over me like cold water, and I finally pulled off at the next gas station I could find. It was a small, quiet place in a dusty town that seemed to barely exist. I pulled up to a pump, killed the engine, and stepped out, my legs shaking. I walked inside to buy a drink and used the bathroom, trying to calm down. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the cashier gave me a nod as I passed. Everything felt normal again. By the time I stepped back outside, my breath had evened out, but that peace shattered the moment I looked toward my car. The black semi was there parked across the street, facing my vehicle, engine idling softly in the night air. I froze. I hadn't seen it pull in. I hadn't heard it approach. It was just there, like it had teleported from the highway to that spot. I scanned for a license plate. There wasn't one. I considered calling the police, but I had no proof of anything. No damage. No words exchanged. Just a vehicle and a gut-deep certainty that something was very, very wrong. I climbed back into my car, locked the doors, and drove off without refueling. I didn't even look back. I didn't want to see if it was following me again. I just drove until I was home. When I arrived, I checked the street, the mirrors, the shadows. Nothing. I parked in the driveway and went inside, locking every door and window. But sleep didn't come easy. My heart was still racing. Every little sound made me jump. And then, maybe an hour later, I heard it again. The low, unmistakable hum of a diesel engine. I crept to the window, parted the curtain, and felt my stomach drop. The black semi was parked directly outside my house. A massive, silent presence on a street far too small for a vehicle that size. It just sat there, engine humming, headlights off. I stared for what felt like an eternity. It didn't move. No one got out. And then after what must have been 20 minutes, it slowly pulled away, vanishing into the darkness. I never called the police. What would I tell them? That a truck followed me and parked outside my house. They'd ask for a plate, for evidence, for anything more than a feeling. But I didn't have it, just fear. For the next several weeks, every time I saw a black truck, my body froze. I flinched at headlights. I avoided long drives. It faded eventually, as most things do, but I never forgot the way that truck made me feel, like prey, like I was being studied, chosen. I still wonder who was behind the wheel and what they wanted. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe they were testing me. I'll never know for sure. But I do know this: there are things out there on the road you can't explain. Things that don't fit into any neat category of crime or accident. Sometimes danger doesn't announce itself. It doesn't scream or chase or flash a weapon. Sometimes it just follows, quietly, persistently, watching what you'll do next. And sometimes it knows exactly where you live. Story 10. The forest that changed my brother. It happened when I was 17, and my younger brother Noah was 15. We lived in a small, wooded town in Oregon, the kind of place where fog hugs the treetops in the morning and the scent of pine clings to everything. Our backyard was dense with trees, leading into a forest that spanned for miles, untouched and unmarked by any official trails. We weren't allowed to go too far in, but like all kids with more curiosity than sense, we explored deeper than we should have. We knew the sounds of that forest by heart: birds, owls, the occasional rustling of raccoons or deer. So when things changed, we noticed immediately. It started subtly, with the forest growing quieter day by day. Fewer birds, fewer animals. The air felt heavier, and Noah started acting strange. At first it was little things. He began wandering into the woods without telling anyone. He'd come back covered in dirt, sometimes with small cuts or scratches, but when we asked what happened, he'd shrug and say he didn't remember. Then he started talking about the clearing, a place deep in the forest where, according to him, everything was silent. No animals, no wind, just a circle of trees and an unnatural stillness. I thought he was trying to scare me, or maybe even impress me with a made-up story, but he insisted it was real. He said there was something in the clearing, something watching, something waiting. My parents dismissed it as teenage weirdness, but I could tell something was wrong. His eyes were different. He stopped sleeping through the night. I'd hear him whispering to himself in the dark. One night, I followed him. He slipped out around midnight, barefoot and silent as a shadow, and walked straight into the woods. I kept my distance, careful not to crunch leaves or snap twigs. The deeper he went, the darker it got. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and all I had to guide me was the faint sound of his footsteps. Then, all at once, everything stopped. No sounds, no wind. Even the air felt wrong, like it was too thick to breathe. That's when I saw at the clearing, just like he described. A perfect circle, surrounded by unnaturally straight trees, each one spaced too evenly. Noah was standing in the center, looking up at something I couldn't see. I stepped closer, and that's when he turned to me. His eyes were wide, like he wasn't really seeing me. "They're listening," he whispered. "You shouldn't be here." I asked him who he meant, but he just stared upward. "They talk through the silence," he said, his voice barely audible. "They want me to stay." I reached for his arm, but the moment I touched him, he screamed a horrible, guttural sound that didn't sound like him at all. He collapsed, unconscious. I dragged him out of the clearing as fast as I could, not looking back. When we made it home, he didn't wake up until the next morning. And when he did, he didn't remember anything. Not the clearing, not the walk, nothing. But after that night, he was never the same. He grew colder, quieter. He barely spoke to anyone and spent most of his time staring out the window, watching the woods. My parents thought it was depression. They sent him to therapy, but nothing helped. I tried to get him to talk about what he saw, what he felt, but every time I mentioned the forest, he'd go pale and shut down. Eventually, he stopped sleeping in his room and started sleeping on the floor near the front door, as if waiting for something to come for him. Then, one morning, we woke up and he was gone. No sign of forced entry, no footprints, just an open front door and a note. "I have to go back. I'm sorry." Search parties combed the woods for days. They found nothing, no clothes, no tracks, no body. The clearing, the one I saw that night, was gone. We went back to the spot where it should have been, but all we found were tangled trees and overgrowth, as if the forest had swallowed it whole. After that, people stopped asking questions. It became one of those family tragedies that nobody talks about. My parents moved away a year later, too heartbroken to stay. But I couldn't leave, not yet. I had to know. So, I started going back into the woods, retracing our steps, trying to find that silence again. I never did. The forest changed after Noah vanished, more alive somehow, but in a way that didn't feel natural. Then, about 3 years later, I got a call from an unknown number. A voice on the other end, raspy and distorted, whispered, "Don't follow." I froze. It sounded like Noah, older, broken, but still him. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I never got another call. I changed my number, but sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers outside my window, low, murmuring voices that speak in patterns I can't quite understand. And sometimes, when I look out into the woods, I swear I see someone standing in the shadows, just watching, not moving, just there. I don't know what Noah saw in that clearing. I don't know what he heard in the silence, but I believe him now. I believe there's something in those woods, something that doesn't belong to this world. I've moved far from that town, but I still dream of the trees. I still see him standing there, looking up, and every now and then, I wake with dirt on my feet, twigs in my bed, and the scent of pine thick in my room. Whatever happened that night, whatever took him, it's not finished. And some nights, I think it's coming for me next.